I would like to use the opportunity today to explain a little bit why I think that behavioral and experimental economics can help to shed new light on old and important questions in voting. And my aim in this talk is to motivate you to look a little bit at this type of literature, and in particular to motivate the younger scholars among us here to perhaps think about doing research yourself in this exciting field. So I will illustrate my claim that behavioral and experimental econ has important things to say on voting while discussing very selected papers of mine. And this is not going to be a survey. I won't talk about the ILE, the internet experiments, which we can perhaps talk about after the talk. So this is not a survey of the literature. It's not even a survey of what I have done in the field. These are not even the most important papers in the field. I don't think so. These are just good illustrations, I hope, for the point I'd like to make here today. So let me start by talking about revolutions. So not political revolutions, as we have heard in the previous talk, but academic revolutions. And I think the public choice movement, of which Gebhard Kirchgessner was one of the founding members, was a crucial moment in the development of economics, because it brought important new insights by applying standard econ outside its classical realm to the political arena. And the tools that were applied were essentially optimization and equilibrium, and underlying these tools were the assumptions of rationality and self-interest. And I think this movement brought very important insights to the profession. Then, perhaps 20 years later, another revolution occurred, which I call the behavioral economics revolution. At some point in the 70s and 80s, scholars like Kahneman and Tversky, in what I would call the first wave behavioral economics, Kahneman, Tversky, and others, amassed mounting evidence showing that these assumptions of rationality and self-interest are descriptively wrong. Real people are not perfectly rational. Real people are not perfectly self-interested. There is some heterogeneity. And they had quite a hard time convincing the econ profession that this is so, but after some time, I think the case was settled. Today, it's clear that these assumptions are descriptively wrong. However, then came the second wave of behavioral economics, which kind of argued that this is not really the point to say whether people in fact are or are not boundedly rational. The point is to argue whether this matters for the questions we're interested in, and these are often interactive situations. So the second wave of behavioral economics then set out to test whether these standard assumptions actually do a good job in predicting the phenomena we're interested in, or whether they don't. And systematic testing showed, and I will show some examples later on, that in some cases this actually works very well. Even though the assumptions are descriptively wrong, it actually works very well. And in other cases it doesn't. And when it does not, we should take aspects of limited rationality and social preferences into account. So the whole idea of behavioral econ is to incorporate insights from psychology and other social sciences into economics to make it a more powerful science of human behavior. So by now, I think this behavioral movement is broadly accepted in the profession. You can see that by the number of publications in top journals that use behavioral approaches. You can see it by the last two presidents of the American Economic Association, which are Bob Shiller, a pioneer in behavioral finance, and Richard Thaler, one of the founding fathers of behavioral economics. And the current president actually is an experimental economist, L. Roth. So also within the public choice group, I think the approach is gaining momentum. At this very conference, I have seen some very interesting papers on the list that use experimental techniques, a handful. So I think there is momentum, there is movement, and I would like to encourage the movement. Here, there has also been a special issue 2 years ago in the European Journal of Political Economy that was dedicated to behavioral approaches to public choice, and this is a survey on the topic. So, as I said, the second wave behavioral economics was concerned with testing when the standard approach predicts well, when it doesn't predict so well. And I think one field where it's particularly relevant to take limited rationality and social preferences into account is voting behavior. And this has been recognized for a long time, actually, in the profession, even though this literature has not been called behavioral. So if you look at the literature on the paradox of voting or expressive voting, scholars have recognized that it's difficult to account for these, for example, large-scale participation in elections with reference to these assumptions of perfect rationality and self-interest. So there is some relation, some pedigree of behavioral research in public choice, and I think it's up and coming. What about experimental public choice? Here, the relation is even stronger and dates back perhaps even further. So because some of the most eminent experimental researchers in the profession, like Charlie Plott and Werner Smith, actually also were presidents of the Public Choice Society, and also here in Europe, some of the most eminent European experimenters were presidents of the European Public Choice Society. So why has it been so popular to use experiments in analyzing questions of public choice? Well, the reason is because this approach has important advantages over other modes of investigation. And the source of this advantage is mainly the ability of the experimenter to control the environment. So we as experimenters, we know exactly what the subjects know about the situation when they're supposed to, at the moment of possible or required action, what the consequences of these actions are, and by paying people according to their choices, we can control incentives. And by controlling these incentives and applying economic theory, we can have a prediction what should happen in this experiment. And then we compare the prediction with the observation to test theories, very simply put. And then we can systematically vary the environment in a controlled fashion to isolate causal factors. And those who don't believe the results can just replicate the experiment themselves, again by virtue of control, because we describe in great detail how we implemented the experiment. So these are important advantages of experimental approaches, but of course there are also limitations, as with any empirical approach. And I think one of the more important limitation is that we have to study very stylized situations to be able to isolate these causal factors and to properly really interpret the data. We need to stylize the situation. When the situation becomes as complex as the world out there, we have a hard time figuring out any causal effects. And then, of course, naturally, the question arises, how do the regularities that we observe in the simple stylized setting then generalize to more complex settings? Do we miss out perhaps on some important factor that plays a role out there or not? That's often a question that we have to face and discuss. I think it's worthwhile to study these simple stylized cases, and I'd like to argue with an analogy to genetics. Genetical researchers have studied very simple organisms like fruit flies and nematodes in great detail. And by doing so, they have learned important insights about the basic building blocks of life. And these basic mechanisms that they've uncovered in studying very simple animals also contributed to understand much more complex organisms like humans. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't argue that we should stop there. We should first study simple things, and once we understand them, we should progress to more complicated things. But it's already quite difficult to understand the apparently simple things. So I'll try to illustrate that also in the experimental approach, that we should first study very simple experiments and then add layers of complexity. So I have chosen 3 topics to illustrate my case that behavioral and experimental economics is useful in understanding voting. So the first topic broadly is about the idea that given policies are more efficient when they are democratically chosen than when they're just imposed from the outside. And I will discuss this in the context of the provision of public goods. Second topic is related to the idea that direct democracy may lead to better policy choices than when you have an individual choosing. And I will discuss the conditions under which this might be the case, in particular when voters are biased. The third topic relates to taxation and voting on taxation. And here the issue is that voters might misperceive the consequences of taxation and vote for tax regimes that are not in their interest, really. And so there will be a bias, and the question will again be, how can we de-bias voters? Under what conditions will this bias actually matter for aggregate outcomes? So the first topic is kind of related to social preference, the second and the third topic are related to bounded rationality. Now, let me start with the first topic, which is embedded in a discussion of cooperation. So let me remind you what are basic cooperation problems. They are characterized by 2 properties. So in a cooperation problem, the thing is that I can do a costly action that is costly to myself, and this action may or may not have a benefit to myself. And the important thing now is that the benefit to myself is lower than the cost. Therefore, if I think of myself self-interestedly, I will not want to do it. Okay? However, this action has positive externalities on others, and so other people will benefit from this costly action. And if these benefits are sufficiently high, I should do it when I think about the group or society at large. So we have this tension between individual rationality, which says don't do it, and social rationality, which says do it. And that's why these problems are also called social dilemma situations. And characteristic for these social dilemma situations are the free rider incentives, because people can take advantage of the public goods once they're there, whether they contributed or not. So everyone thinks, why me? Someone else should provide the public good. So standard theory predicts that under these conditions, these public goods will be underprovided. There will be too little cooperation. Now, what can you do? This is an important problem. It's pervasive in all realms of life, in private organizations, in government organizations. So it's a key governance issue on how to deal with this problem. And so scholars have been thinking about this for a long time, and an obvious solution to the problem is to discourage the free riding. So how can you do this? You can sanction the free riders. So the classic solution to this problem is to enact a rule or a law that makes contributing to the public good an obligation, and then you back this rule by a formal sanction. And standard economic theory tells us, well, this approach is only going to work if the sanctions are strong enough, if they actually deter the free riding. If they're just weak, people will ignore them and go on as before. So they won't work. So that's a key insight from standard economics. And this is really an old idea. This is a picture of the cover of the book Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, and it's an allegoric representation of the sovereign who consists of lots of individuals. Here these dots are the individual people, and the sovereign holds in the hand the symbol of power to sanction the people, to bring order and to provide these public goods. And Hobbes famously noted that when men live without the common power to keep them all in awe with the sword, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So this is an old thought in scholarship, but the problem is we cannot always use the sword. We cannot always use very deterrent, strong formal sanctions. So what do we do when we have only weaker sanctions in place? And here's a thought by another prominent thinker, Alexis de Tocqueville. He was traveling the United States and an avid observer of this young democracy, and he noticed that it is not always feasible to consult the whole people, either directly or indirectly, in the formation of the law. But it cannot be denied that when such a measure is possible, the authority of the law is very much augmented. So the thought that de Tocqueville had here is that voting may make laws more legitimate, which in turn increases the compliance. And this is, of course, particularly relevant when sanctions are non-deterrent, because if they are deterrent, you will obey the law anyway, just out of your self-interest. So these were kind of the leading thoughts behind an experiment that I did with Lars Feld some years back in Switzerland. And this is a very simple experiment that we ran there in Switzerland. We put these undergrad students in St. Gallen, we put them into groups of 3 people and endowed them with 20 points, which were worth money. And the income of these people then came from how much money they kept for themselves and how much money they put into the group, into this group account. And so for each point that's in the group account, independent of who put these points there, you get half a point out. So this structure reflects the classic dilemma situation, because from an individual perspective, it's really a bad investment. It costs you a point, you get half a point out, that's a bad investment, don't do it. However, from a group perspective, it's a very good investment, because you pay 1 point and the group as a whole gets 1.5 points. So there's an efficiency gain there. So this is a very stylized, simple representation of this public good problem. And so we were interested in what does the sword do in this problem, what do formal sanctions do, is, do people respond as economic theory says? So we did a very simple experiment. In one case, we imposed a severe sanction, which is strong enough to induce a fully rational, fully self-interested person to contribute. In one case, the sanction was too weak to induce a rational and self-interested person to contribute, and in the control, there was no sanction. So then what happened is that in the no-law condition, people contributed some. The standard prediction would be 0, but they contributed some. We were not surprised. There's mounting evidence on this type of game before, showing that people, even in one-shot situations which are anonymous, people contribute some. So we were not so surprised about that. When we impose mild law, nothing much happens. This is not a significant difference here, so economic theory was kind of right that this wouldn't help. And severe sanctions, they do. If they were strong enough, the big sword did the job, people complied, they understood the incentives, and they complied with it. So far, everything is fine with standard economic theory, except for the level, which is a bit too high. But we were, of course, interested in voting. We were interested in that these laws, they don't normally fall from the skies, they have to be voted by the people. They are endogenous in this sense. So we implemented a 2-stage game. In the first stage, people decide, do you want the law or not? And then in the second stage, they play according to what they've chosen. So, for example, if they choose severe law, in the first stage, they get severe law with this deterrent sanction. And the prediction is that severe law should be welcomed. Everyone, or the majority, should accept the severe law because people are rational and anticipate that if it's there, everyone is going to comply, and so no harm is done. Nobody's sanctioned. So this is an efficiency improving movement, and people will agree, as in this picture of the Leviathan with the many individuals constituting the sovereign, that they agree that the Leviathan can punish them. Rational individuals will agree to this. And then, given that it's there, they will contribute. However, the case with the mild sanction is different because everyone anticipates that it's not going to work, and given that it's not going to work, you get punished, and then you would be shooting yourself in the foot, voting for a sanction where you get, you don't obey the law, and then you get punished. So the prediction is that people will reject it. So what we find is, yes, indeed, the severe sanction is very popular. 75% of the groups accept it, and if it's there, they comply with it. Again, no big surprise from standard perspective. But the big surprise was what happened when people voted on these mild sanctions. So now we found that actually in 60% of the cases, people accepted the law, and then, if it's there, the contributions were much higher, about twice as high as when it was just imposed on them. And this is what we like to call the dividend of democracy, in the sense that this law, which is not backed by a big stick or a big sword, has much better legitimacy, is much better accepted if it's accepted in a vote. So is chosen rather than imposed. So then the rest of the paper is kind of concerned with checking why is this the case. Is this perhaps just a selection effect, or is it a causal effect? We argue that it's a causal effect. We then also try to understand the mechanism behind this, and we think the mechanism has to do with signaling. So when you see that other people vote for this law, this induces the belief in you that they will comply with this law. Why else would they vote for it? And this belief might then trigger the willingness of people to also contribute if they have a social preference that is called conditional cooperation. So conditional cooperation means that you are willing to do your share if you know, or if you're confident that other people will also do their fair share. And that's, we find supporting evidence, or that is in line with that we find a positive correlation between the expected contribution of others and the own contribution, which is consistent with the social preference of conditional cooperation. So you can say, well, this is a very simple stylized experiment. This is really a fruit fly here. How robust is this going to be to a number of variations? So perhaps this is going to wash out if you repeat the whole thing. And the choice was really not so appealing. It was like anarchy versus mild law or severe law. So there are many other options you could think of. So what about informal sanctions, which are actually very common, like these more horizontal, peer pressure type of sanctions in organizations? What about the law was free to enforce? In reality, you will have to have a judiciary system. You need police, you need judges, and so on to enforce the law. How about that? If this is costly, will people still like it? And so we looked at a number of other issues. Also, this was run in Switzerland, and the Swiss might be peculiar anyway, because they vote all the time on all kinds of issues. So is this going to work in other countries too? So all these issues, these 5 issues here, we addressed in a follow-up paper we published a few years ago in the Review of Economic Studies with Thomas Markussen and Louis Puterman. And this then becomes a very complex experiment, and that generates many interesting results. But one of the results was that we also find in this much more complex setting support for this basic claim of the dividend of democracy. And we actually also find it for informal sanctions. So if people choose informal sanctions, they work much better than if you impose informal sanctions. In another follow-up study, which we took Kenju Kamei on board, published in Experimental Economics, we went even a step further. We added another layer of complexity. So we did not only have these 5 points, but we also allowed them to choose the type of formal sanction. So how deterrent should it be? When should you be lenient, when not? So that was another layer of complexity. And even in this case, we found some supportive evidence for this dividend of democracy. So this series of experiments was supposed to illustrate this case. You should study the fruit fly first and then add layers of complexity to see how robust this phenomenon is, that social preferences might shape efficiency via voting. Second topic I'd like to talk about is a topic that goes back to the dawn of the French Revolution. A few years before the storm of the Bastille, 4 years before the storm of the Bastille, the philosophers and mathematicians started to think about how are they going to run the place once they get rid of the king. So, and then various ideas came up, and one was this Condor jury theorem, which essentially says that groups of people making choices by majority voting, so committees as they are called in the literature, make better choices than any individual member of this committee could have done. And this is true for so-called common interest situations. And these are situations in which people generally agree on the goal, but they disagree on the means, what's the best means to reach that goal. So we would all agree that we would like to have economic stability or economic prosperity, that we would like to reduce unemployment or pollution, but we disagree on what is the best way to reach economic stability. We're uncertain. And the Marquis explained this problem in the context of a jury, which has to decide on whether a particular person, a defendant, should be sent to jail or be acquitted. And this jury would agree that justice should be served. They all agree. And they agree that justice will be served if the guilty man is sent to prison and the innocent man is acquitted. They all agree. But they are uncertain whether this particular defendant is now guilty or not. And so, under some assumptions, you can derive this theorem, and an important assumption is that all individual members of this committee have positive information. So they are more likely to be right than wrong. So if the guy is guilty, they're more likely to think that he's guilty than that he's innocent. So this is an important assumption here. Another important assumption is that they make their decisions independently. Okay, everyone gets a signal or has an opinion about this defendant, and then everyone votes according to his or her personal opinion. And this is true that the committees make better choices in small groups already, but it gets more pronounced the larger the group is. So this was an argument in favor of direct democracy. So let me illustrate this idea in a very simple setting. In a group of 3 people, each person is 70% likely to make the right choice. So when will the group make the right choice by majority voting? Well, this will be the case when everyone makes the right choice, or when a majority, so 2 out of 3 makes the right choice, then you get this probability. But there are 3 ways for one person to be wrong in a group of 3, so you have to multiply by 3. And then you do the math to see that in this simple example, the group is 78% likely to make the right choice, whereas each individual is only 70% likely to make the right choice. And this phenomenon is called information aggregation. So if you trace this out here, so I discussed this example, individuals are 70% likely to know the truth. The group is likely, almost 80% likely to know the truth. So we get this point. And if you then trace it out for all probabilities above 0.5, you get this upward bulging green line. So this is the information aggregation that results from voting. However, what happens if people are biased or prejudiced? So if they are less likely to know the truth than not, then you actually get negative information aggregation. So if people are less likely than 50% to make the right choice, voting is a very bad idea because the group is even less likely than any of the individuals to make the right choice. So if people are prejudiced or biased, don't vote. That's a prediction or the implication of this theory. There's negative information aggregation. So in a project with Becky Morton and Marco Piovizon, we wanted to see, well, is this true? This is currently under revision in Games and Economic Behavior. So can we find evidence for this wisdom of the crowds effect, this upward bulging? Can we find evidence for the dark side of the vote, as we call it? That's the title of the paper, of this downward bulging when voters are biased. And so how we do this is as follows. We give people quiz questions to which there is a true answer. We know the answer, and we propose 2 answers. One is the right answer, one is the wrong answer. They vote on which is the right answer. It's a committee of 5 people. If the group gets it right, the majority of the group gets it right, each person gets money independent of what they voted. If the group gets it wrong, nobody gets money, independent of what they voted individually. So then we give them 30 questions. 20 are kind of easy questions on which, after pre-testing, we knew that most people kind of tend to get it right. So the PI is above 0.5. But we also gave them 10 trick questions, so to speak, in which we knew after pre-testing, and we were inspired by research of Kahneman and others, where people tend to get it systematically wrong, so where people tend to be biased. And we let them vote on these questions. They have to vote, they can't talk about it. There is no cost of voting, and we only tell them the result after they voted on all 30 questions. So this is the outcome. You see the circles show the average outcome of this experiment. You can see that these blue dots are above the line if the individual, for easy questions, if the individual probability was above 0.5, and tend to be below the line for the bias question. So we find evidence for this S shape with some imagination. You can recognize this S shape here. So we were then interested, we said, okay, that's an interesting finding, but we were then interested in how can we debias people. Yeah? So, and then we thought, okay, various forms of social communication might be interesting to study, because as you've seen, this Condor's jury theorem has some assumptions. One of the assumptions is that people vote independently. This will typically not be the case, certainly not in a jury. People will deliberate before they make a choice, so the signals become correlated. And so we wanted to study this issue. What about communication, social communication, when these signals become correlated? And so one case that I will discuss here is an opinion poll. So how the experiment now works is we show them the question, we suggest these two answers, A or B, then we ask them, what do you think is the right answer, A or B? Then we tell them, in a previous experiment, 70% of the people thought A is the right answer. Now please vote, is it A or B? What's the outcome? Is the green squares. Now you see that this whole S shape becomes very much exacerbated. So the polls make choices more rational when people are well informed, but it's total disaster when people are biased. So when people are biased and you let them vote and you give them an opinion poll in addition, it's all, in this experiment at least, they were almost never made the right choice. So opinion poll improved the efficiency when voters tend to get it right anyway, but it reduced the efficiency even further when they were biased. So the reason seemed to be that people just ignored their individual signals and followed the public signals, and in the paper we have a little model where we discuss when this is actually rational to do. So what's the upshot is that there is evidence for information aggregation, but there's also evidence for the dark side of the vote, and it's a bad idea to vote when people are biased. And communication does not necessarily, this type of communication at least, does not necessarily eliminate the problem. Here it just amplified the whole thing. So let me now talk about the third topic, which is about tax misperception. I'd like to start with a very basic fundamental proposition of public economics, which can be found in any undergraduate textbook, and this is actually copied from an undergraduate textbook, Rosen and Geyer, which shows demand and supply in a competitive market. You have an initial equilibrium at X0 and P0, and then you impose a transaction tax which is levied on the buyers. And the consequence, as you all are aware if you studied Econ 101, is that this demand function is shifted down, you get this new equilibrium at D, quantity falls, consumer price goes up, producer price goes down, you have some tax revenue and an efficiency loss and excess burden. So, and the fundamental proposition of public economics now is that you get exactly the same result if you levy the equivalent tax on the sellers. And this proposition is called the tax liability side equivalence. It doesn't matter, according to the standard textbook, whether you tax one side or the other side. The legal incidence of who pays the tax is irrelevant. What counts is the economic incidence, who bears the tax. The distribution of rent is driven by economic incidents, not legal incidents. Forget about legal incidents. That's what they say here in the textbook. Can this be true? I mean, when we talk about funding social security contributions, there's often a big debate about who should pay how much, the employers or the employees. Can this be true? Well, it's an easy job to test this by use of experimental economics. We have the tools to do this since Vernon Smith developed it. We can induce demand and supply. We can see where prices go, and then we shift demand, holding supply constant, see what happens. We shift supply, see what happens. If it's the same, then tax liability side equivalence holds. If not, then not. It's a very straightforward task for experimenters. Well, it sounds easier than it actually is. Well, many people have done this, and the overall finding is that this is a very robust proposition. It's actually a very robust, theoretically very robust proposition. You don't need to have competitive markets for this to hold. And it's also empirically a very robust proposition. If you do this in the lab, you systematically find that the standard textbook, Econ 101, is right. And this even holds for more complex markets like gift exchange labor markets, which some people think are more typical for some types of labor markets, at least. It even holds there. So that's kind of remarkable, isn't it? But the starting point of the joint project I did with Rupert Sausgruber from the Wirtschaftsuniversität in Vienna was that, the bounded rationality of people may not play so much a role in these competitive markets as we've just seen. These are boundedly rational people who participate in these markets. Nevertheless, you get an outcome that is perfectly in line with the standard textbook, which assumes everyone is rational and self-interested. We said, okay, this may not matter so much in markets, but it may actually matter in voting. Because if you vote about whether you want to have the tax or not, you should predict what is going to be the consequence if we tax it this way or that way. And if people think, in people's minds, they think there is a difference whether we tax it on the buyers or on the sellers, then they will not accept one type of taxation, even though they are the same objectively. But in reality, you will only see one type of tax realized. So that was the starting point of our paper here, that misperception may well be irrelevant for outcome in competitive markets, but may distort democratic choices. And that's because people have to predict what taxation will do to the distribution of rents. So how do we do this? So first, these participants trade in a market, and they earn income by trading. So this is like in these other experiments that I just explained with tax side liability equivalence. And then at some point we tell people, sorry folks, now we impose a tax on the transactions. And we will just take the tax revenue, we will not redistribute it. It's just wasted for you. We'll just keep it. However, you can decide how we want to tax these transactions. So one option is that we tax you, the buyers. Okay, so in this experiment, only the buyers were allowed to vote. One option is we tax you at the rate T. The other option is we tax the sellers at a higher rate than T. Which one do you want? Okay. So here is the graph. So this is a bit, the stepwise functions. This is the S naught is the original supply, D naught is the original demand. So you have an equilibrium at A. And then the question is, do you want the tax on the buyers, which shifts down this demand here, or do you want the tax on the sellers of more than the tax of the buyers? And then, of course, all you need to know, you don't need to know the whole parameters of this experiment. All you need to know, if you believe in tax liability side equivalence, is higher taxes are worse. That's all you need to know, because it's all waste in this experiment. So in this example here, the consumer rent is smaller with the higher tax than with the tax on the buyers. So they would be shooting themselves in the foot if they say, I'd like to have a high tax on the sellers, because the tax will be partly shifted to them. And that's our hypothesis, really, is that people underestimate the extent of tax shifting. They think legal incidents is what counts. So if we tax the sellers, they are going to bear the tax. They underestimate how much the tax is going to be shifted to them. That's our behavioral hypothesis. And that's, if you think so, then you would be willing to accept higher taxes on the other side of the market. So what do we find is essentially, yes, the bias is actually quite pronounced. In 2 out of 3 cases, people prefer the high taxes on the other side to the low taxes on your own side. And that's costly because also in these markets, we again find this robust finding that tax LSE holds in these markets because prices are flexible in these markets. So we were not surprised about this result because Rupert and I, we had a paper a few years earlier that had already made this point. It was published in Public Choice. And in this paper, we were very careful to kind of show all aspects to be really sure that it was a misperception and not something else. But in this paper, the focus was really on the debiasing because we kind of knew that people had this bias. Then we were interested, okay, given that they have the bias, how can we make it go away? So then one way to do that is to allow them to learn. Yeah? And I can talk a little bit more about this afterwards if you like, but it depends a lot on how you do the learning and the repetition. What I'd like to talk more about here is the deliberation, because again, that would be a typical thing when you have the voting, that people would be discussing the issue before they actually proceed to the vote. And how we implemented this in this experiment was people could chat with each other. So this was a computerized experiment. People would sit in front of a computer and they are explained everything. They have experience by trading, and then we tell them, okay, now here's the tax. Which one do you want? And then they can send each other messages for 5 minutes. And they have ID numbers, so they can have a real conversation. They said, number 3, I don't think you're right, and so on. So they can chat with each other, and they chat a lot. They send each other lots of messages. And then we classify these messages as pertinent or not, correct or not, and so we can see how the discussion evolves. So one thing, and how it affects the voting, that's our main interest, really. So one thing we see is that deliberation is actually persuasive. So if you get lots of messages at the beginning that says, I think we should tax the sellers, you are more inclined to also say, yes, I agree, we should tax the sellers, and then actually to vote in favor of the sellers. But the converse is also true. If you get lots of messages at the beginning which says, I think we should tax the buyers, you also tend to say, yeah, I think we should tax the buyers, and then actually vote in this favor. So what we see here is that opinions are initially diverse, and in the control treatment, where they can't discuss, they remain diverse. Okay? But when they can discuss, they tend to agree. So the variance within the group is reduced. But what we find is that the variance across the groups is increased. So they agree on things, but not necessarily on the right thing. So this is a phenomenon called group polarization in the literature. So surprisingly to us, the ability to discuss freely didn't help in this case. So the bias did persist here. So let me conclude here and make it brief to have some more minutes for the discussion. The point of my presentation was to illustrate by use of some simple experiments, fruit flies, and then with some add-ons, to argue that social preferences and limited rationality are important to understand voting, that we should take them into account, that we should test when it matters and when it doesn't matter. And in some cases, as you've seen, you will see that it does matter. Some cases, it does not matter. I have only talked about 3 selected topics. There are many other topics like voting on redistribution, where obviously social preferences would matter a lot. There are other topics that would be interesting to study. But I'll leave it at that and just renew my call to, in particular, to the young scholars here among us to look at this literature, to think about doing experiments yourself. I think this is an exciting research agenda. Much remains to be done, and I invite, in particular, the young people to contact me this afternoon with their ideas and questions on what to do here. Thank you very much.